That quote points to something subtle, but important. The way belief can blur with intention. Especially when it comes to something like charity, something that's supposed to be simple, generous, and good. Helping people in need shouldn't be complicated. But it gets complicated fast when religious institutions are involved. Because while faith-based giving is often framed as pure generosity, there's usually more going on under the surface. You can see this clearly when you look at how religious charities operate. They provide food, shelter, medical aid, education. And that's real, and often helpful. But these services often come with strings attached. Not obvious ones, maybe. But there's a framework, a worldview, that's built into the delivery of the help itself. In many cases, the charity isn't just about meeting material needs. It's about promoting a belief system, a mission. Sometimes overtly, sometimes through subtle nudges. And that's where the hidden costs start to show. Let's start with the numbers. Religious organizations are among the largest providers of charitable services in the world. In the U.S. alone, billions of dollars pass through churches and religious nonprofits every year. That money comes from private donations, tax-deductible giving, government contracts, and volunteers who give their time. On the surface, that looks great. It sounds like religion is doing its part. But look closer, and you'll start to see the cracks. For one thing, religious charities benefit massively from public subsidies. Not just in donations, which are tax-exempt, but in the form of direct government support. Churches and faith-based groups often receive contracts to run food banks, addiction treatment programs, homeless shelters, refugee aid, disaster relief. And in many of those cases, they're allowed to operate in ways that a secular nonprofit never could. They can hire and fire based on belief. They can prioritize members of their faith. They can integrate religious teachings into basic services. In some cases, they even require participation in prayer or worship to receive help. That's not charity. That's conditional aid. It turns the vulnerable into an audience. It treats crisis as an opportunity, not just to help, but to convert. And while it's rarely framed that way publicly, it's often an open goal behind the scenes. Now, to be fair, not every religious charity works like this. Some provide genuinely secular aid with no proselytizing, no agenda. But even then, their operations still reinforce the power of institutions that promote certain worldviews over others. And when those institutions are tax-exempt, legally privileged, and deeply tied into state support, we need to ask hard questions about what's really going on. Charity becomes a form of soft power. And for people on the receiving end, that matters. Because when help is conditional, or even just framed through a moral lens, it creates hierarchy. One side gives. One side receives. One side is seen as good. The other, as needy, lost, or broken. And when the charity is religious, that dynamic often comes with an implied moral judgment. Poverty is tied to sin. Suffering is tied to redemption. Need is framed as a test of faith, or an opportunity to find it. But people aren't problems to be fixed. They're not just empty vessels waiting for spiritual answers. They're human beings. Often caught in systems they didn't choose. Systems that fail them, abandon them, then tell them to be grateful when someone shows up with a sandwich and a sermon. This is where the damage happens. It's not just about food or money. It's about autonomy. About dignity. About whether help lifts someone up. Or pushes a belief onto them while they're at their most vulnerable. And it goes deeper. Because the influence of religious charity isn't just local, it's global. In many parts of the world, faith-based organizations are among the few sources of education, healthcare, or infrastructure. That's partly because public services are underfunded or non-existent. But instead of building secular systems, people often rely on religious aid networks. Which means that belief systems get bundled with basic survival. This is especially true in areas affected by colonization. In places where missionaries replaced local cultures with imported doctrines. Where schools were built, yes, but only if students accepted a new religion. Where medicine came with a Bible. Where charity was never neutral. And today, we still see echoes of that. In Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia. In refugee camps and rural villages. That's the hidden cost. It's not just the conditions placed on the recipients. It's the long-term impact on institutions, on communities, on public trust. Because when people rely on religious charity to survive, it weakens the demand for real, universal, rights-based systems. Systems that treat help not as a gift, but as a guarantee. And when those systems are missing, religious power grows. Not because it's better, but because it fills the gap. That's not generosity. That's dependence. And that dependence doesn't just shape how people survive, it shapes how they vote, how they think, how they define morality. Because charity isn't just about meeting needs. It's about power. And religious institutions have understood that for a very long time. When you provide the basics of life, food, water, shelter, you don't just earn trust. You earn influence. That influence shows up politically, especially in places where religious groups take on social roles the state should be filling. They become the de facto support system. And when they do that, they gain a moral high ground, the ability to say, "We're helping," while the government fails. And sometimes, they're right. But the solution can't be to let ideology take over public services. Because what often gets lost in the narrative is why public systems fail in the first place. Sometimes it's incompetence. More often, it's deliberate underfunding. A long-term shift away from universal programs toward privatized or community-led alternatives. And religious charities step in, with grants, volunteers, donations, and offer a patch. A patch that looks good on the surface, but leaves people more divided and more dependent in the long run. And if you're wondering why secular nonprofits don't fill that space more aggressively, part of the answer is visibility. Religious groups often have huge built-in audiences, networks, and fundraising tools that come from decades, sometimes centuries, of cultural infrastructure. They're embedded in daily life. In rituals. In routines. They're seen as morally legitimate, even when their messaging excludes or harms certain groups. Secular organizations don't get that kind of automatic trust. In fact, they often have to work twice as hard to prove their intentions are good, because they don't wrap their work in spiritual language. They don't offer the comfort of belief. And because of that, they're sometimes seen as less compassionate, even when their services are more equitable. That's another hidden cost. The quiet pressure to link goodness with belief. We see this in how people talk about morality. The assumption that ethical behavior flows naturally from faith. That generosity and compassion are religious values first. And everything else comes second. This creates a subtle hierarchy, where even well-meaning charity ends up reinforcing the idea that moral worth is tied to religious identity. But morality doesn't need religion. In fact, when you separate the two, you often get clearer thinking. You can measure outcomes. You can prioritize fairness. You can hold organizations accountable without worrying about offending a sacred institution. Religious charities, by contrast, are often shielded from scrutiny. They're seen as above politics. They get tax breaks, public endorsements, and free labor from people who see volunteering as a spiritual duty. That creates a kind of protective bubble, one that makes it harder to question where the money goes, who gets served, and who gets left out. And make no mistake, people do get left out. Religious charities often impose behavioral or belief-based conditions for help. LGBTQ+ people are regularly turned away or discriminated against. Single mothers are shamed. Refugees who don't share the dominant faith may be excluded, or pushed to convert. People with addictions are offered spiritual cures instead of medical ones. These aren't rare exceptions. They're baked into the structure. The belief system isn't just alongside the charity. It is the charity. And that brings us to another problem, the lack of transparency. Many religious charities operate as part of churches. Meanwhile, secular groups that focus on harm reduction, scientific methods, or rights-based frameworks struggle for visibility. They don't get the same romantic narrative. They don't get volunteers for spiritual reasons. And in many cases, they don't get funding from governments that prefer community partnerships, which too often means churches. So the cycle continues. Public services erode. Faith groups step in. And a whole generation grows up thinking that's how it's supposed to be. That if you want help, you need to be humble, grateful, open to belief. But help shouldn't be a transaction. It shouldn't come with messaging. It shouldn't come with theology. It should come because people deserve it. Because dignity isn't a reward for believing the right thing, it's a baseline. But that's not how religious charity often works. It's framed as generosity, but functionally, it serves to protect and promote institutions. It's not just about helping people, it's about preserving power. And that power often goes unquestioned, because it's wrapped in kindness. Look closely, though, and you'll see the mechanics. When large religious organizations fund schools, clinics, or shelters, they're not just offering services, they're building visibility, influence, cultural loyalty. People are less likely to criticize an institution that gave them food when they were hungry, or took care of their child when no one else would. And that loyalty can be powerful, especially when it comes to public perception. You see it during scandals. When abuse is exposed, when money is misused, when leaders are caught in corruption, there's often a cushion, a kind of moral credit built up through years of charitable work. Yes, there were failures, people say. But think of all the good they've done. That's how power protects itself. And it's not just about public opinion, it's about political access. Religious charities are often deeply embedded in policymaking. They sit on advisory boards. They shape legislation. They influence public funding decisions, especially in areas like education, family planning, healthcare, addiction recovery. And they often do it with the moral authority that comes from being the helpers. But help, when used as leverage, stops being help. It becomes strategy. And that strategy puts real pressure on the people who need assistance. Sometimes it's subtle, a prayer before dinner at a shelter. A Bible left in a refugee welcome bag. A counselor who frames trauma in spiritual terms. Other times, it's direct. Required church attendance. Conversion expectations. Abstinence mandates. Behavior rules that reflect religious doctrine. For someone in crisis, those conditions can feel like the only option. When you're hungry, you don't argue about theology. When you're unhoused, you don't critique the system. You take what you're offered. And that's what makes this so effective, and so troubling. Because the psychological message is clear, your worth is tied to your compliance. The help isn't yours by right. It's a gift, given by those who know better. And over time, that dynamic shapes not just individuals, but entire communities. Especially when there's no alternative. If secular options are underfunded, invisible, or out of reach, then religious aid becomes the default. And that allows belief systems to spread not through persuasion, but through dependency. It's not a debate. It's not a discussion. It's survival. That's not freedom of belief, it's pressure dressed up as benevolence. And what's often forgotten in all this is that true charity doesn't need a belief system to justify it. You don't need a reward in the afterlife to care about someone's suffering. You don't need spiritual framing to understand that people deserve safety, food, support, and love. In fact, the idea that you need religion to be good is one of the oldest and most persistent myths around charity. But it falls apart under scrutiny. Look at the data. Secular people give, volunteer, and organize too, often through mutual aid, grassroots projects, community efforts. They just don't always call it charity. They don't always brand it with an ideology. And they're often left out of the conversation because their work isn't tied to ancient institutions or theological language. But that doesn't make it less valuable. In many ways, it makes it more honest. Because when you help someone without asking them to believe what you believe, the moment charity becomes a tool to advance belief. It stops being about the recipient. It becomes about the giver. And that shift, from support to self-image, is where the harm begins. Because now, it's not about needs. It's about narratives. About the story the giver tells themselves. About what kind of person they are. About what their beliefs mean in the world. That's the hidden cost of religious charity. It can look generous. It can feel generous. But when you peel back the layers, you see something else, something structured, strategic, and deeply tied to preserving power. Because when help becomes a means of control, it loses its purpose. That's why the conversation about religious charity isn't about intention, it's about structure. About power. About how compassion can be turned into leverage, and how belief can slip in through the back door under the banner of kindness. But there are other ways to do this. There are secular alternatives, and they're not just theoretical. Across the world, you'll find organizations run by doctors, teachers, aid workers, neighbors, who aren't guided by dogma, but by principle. Who believe that food is a right. That housing is a right. That safety, education, and healthcare shouldn't depend on who you pray to. Or whether you pray at all. These are people who understand that helping someone doesn't require a sacred text, it just requires empathy. And systems. And accountability. That's the key difference. When charity is treated as a right, not a gift, the entire structure shifts. People are no longer expected to perform humility or gratitude. They're not asked to attend services, change their beliefs, or present themselves as deserving. They're just people, getting what they need. And when that happens, trust grows. People stop seeing help as a debt. They stop seeing institutions as judges. They stop hiding parts of themselves just to get support. They start showing up. And that shift, from conditional care to unconditional dignity, is where real change begins. Because now you're not building dependency. You're building solidarity. You're not saving anyone, you're standing with them. That kind of giving isn't flashy. It doesn't always come with ceremonies or stories. It doesn't promise cosmic rewards. But it leaves something stronger behind. Respect. So maybe the real question isn't whether religious charities do some good. Many do. It's whether that good is neutral. Or transactional. Whether it expands people's choices. Or narrows them. Whether it centers belief. Or humanity. Because charity isn't supposed to be a branding tool. Or a recruiting method. Or a way to make ideology look benevolent. It's supposed to be about need. And when that gets lost, when belief gets wrapped around care, we all pay the price. Not always visibly. Not all at once. But slowly. Quietly. As public trust erodes. As rights are replaced by favors. As generations grow up thinking that goodness must be religious. And that help comes with strings. But it doesn't have to be that way. We can build better systems. Ones rooted in fairness, not faith. In evidence, not dogma. In the idea that people matter. Not because of what they believe, but because they exist. That's not just possible. It's already happening, in quiet corners, in volunteer networks, in clinics, schools, shelters. All around the world. Places where people give without converting. Help without judging. Show up without needing a spiritual script. And the more we support those efforts, with time, money, policy, attention, the more we loosen the grip of institutions that use charity to reinforce power. We stop rewarding ideology for doing what society should do already. And we start asking better questions. Not how generous is this organization? But does this help without conditions? Not how much good does religion do? But who is harmed, or excluded, when it does? Because real compassion doesn't come with a sermon. It comes with open hands. No strings attached.